formerly ran the youth program as a legal aid lawyer for New Hampshire Legal Assistance. Also a published author, she served on the New Hampshire boards of Planned Parenthood and the American Civil Liberties Union. Emmett Soldati is an activist, a small business owner, and a resident of Somersworth. He runs the Teetotaler Cafe in Somersworth, and he is a graduate of the London School of Economics. A member and leader of New Hampshire's LGBTQ+ community, he also co-founded the Tri-City Reproductive Justice for All Coalition and was recently in the news for winning a lawsuit against Facebook. J. Surdukowski is a Concord lawyer at Sulloway and Hollis. He specializes in defense litigation for hospitals and doctors. And he has served as campaign counsel for two of our Democratic candidates for governor, Molly Kelly and Colin Van Ostern. He currently serves on the board of the Currier Museum of Art, where he is one of the youngest trustees ever to serve on that board. He also chairs the St. Paul's School of Advanced Studies program, Board of Overseers. That's a program that since 1958 has provided challenging summer study opportunities to over 12,000 Granite State public school students. Craig Thompson is a colleague of mine in the legislature, and like me, he is a first-term Democratic representative. He's from Harrisville. He owns the Mayfair Farm, which is a livestock farm where he distributes pork and lamb and produces baked goods and maple syrup in a thriving operation where his website points out that he also manages to pay his workers a living wage. His other experience includes service on the Harrisville Planning Board, the board of the Monadnock Food Co-op, and the New Hampshire Farm Bureau Legislative Affairs Committee. And finally, Cinde Warmington is a partner and leader of the healthcare practice of the Concord law firm Shaheen and Gordon, where she specializes in providing legal assistance to healthcare providers and organizations. Before becoming a lawyer, she worked in healthcare for over 2 decades, starting as a phlebotomist and eventually holding clinical and managerial positions, including laboratory manager and chief operating officer. She is the current chairwoman of the New Hampshire Democratic Party Platform Committee. And one note, not with us tonight is the 6th Democratic candidate for the District 2 seat. His name is John Shea of Nelson. He is a former executive counselor who held the seat from 2006 to 2010. Again, we'll have 1 minute per question and we'll get started. So first question. What is the key reason why you decided to run for executive council, and is there a particular issue that's extremely important to you where you feel your presence on the council will make a big difference? And we'll start with Jay Surdukowski.
I don't see him here.
Yeah, I don't see him either, so progress without him. And if I see that he comes up, I'll let you know.
Okay, then we will move on to our next candidate, Craig Thompson.
There we go. Thanks, David. I appreciate the question, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here this evening. I jumped into this race because it was clear back in December or January that the 3 candidates who had already entered represented a pretty homogenous pool to choose from. 3 attorneys / lobbyists from Concord. And as a farmer and a state representative and a small business owner, I felt that I could bring a diversity of experiences and a different voice to the race. And really, that issue that for me is the single most important issue that we all face is the climate crisis. For me, it's not something I read about in the news or something that's going on in Australia. It's happening every day on my farm. And I have to figure out how to manage it on a daily basis. So I see the Executive Council as an opportunity to pull a slightly different lever when it comes to creating the right outcome. Because we know that the climate crisis is the one issue on which we don't get a second chance. So for me, from the Executive Council, there's going to be a litmus test. There we go.
Thank you. Up next, Emmett Soldati.
Thank you, David, and the Progressive Caucus. So I decided to get in the race, not because I necessarily knew who was running, but because I felt that the experiences of having been born and raised and lived in the smallest and one of the poorest cities in New Hampshire, that's Somersworth, my hometown. It gives you a lived experience of our state, of seeing this place from the outside in. You know, when we talk about progressive causes, too often the folks that those causes are meant to benefit, whether it's immigrants, LGBTQ people, SNAP recipients, those in recovery with a substance use disorder, don't actually have a seat at a table, don't have a voice. And I think it's time to start changing that. And so my experience as a small business owner, a member of the LGBTQ community, someone that is in long-term recovery, I see the Executive Council as a huge way to give people in small communities across this state their access to power to transform New Hampshire for our next generation.
Thank you. Cinde Warmington.
David, one of the candidates asked for a warning on the time limit, so I'll start telling people when there's 15 seconds. I just wanted to let them know that.
Okay, that's fine. And by the way, if anybody wants me to repeat the questions at any time, just ask me to do that. And up next, Cinde Warmington.
Thank you, and thank you to the House Progressive Caucus. The key reason that I got into this race is because this is the most important election of our lifetime. Everything is on the line: healthcare, education, voting rights, reproductive rights, workers' rights, the climate. Everything is on the line in this election, and none of us can sit on the sidelines. And my issue, I would bring 40 years of healthcare experience to the Executive Council, the moderator said, 20 years as a healthcare attorney, 20 years in healthcare before that. And right now we have no one on the Executive Council with a healthcare background, despite that most of our state budget is in DHHS. And I think that's an important perspective to bring.
15 seconds.
I also have, and we'll talk more about this tonight, but a transformational vision for the Executive Council that I think is unique to my candidacy.
Thank you. Leah Plunkett.
Thank you so much for hosting this. I got into the race after over a decade of Planned Parenthood board service. I was on the board of the Planned Parenthood of Northern New England Health Centers when we were defunded going back to 2011. I stood on the front lines of protecting Planned Parenthood and reproductive health care and reproductive justice. Last summer, during the fight over Attorney General Gordon MacDonald's nomination to the state Supreme Court, I was on the front lines as the chair at that point of the Planned Parenthood New Hampshire Action Fund, of standing up courageously and firmly against that nomination, and on behalf of only having nominees who can be trusted to support rights in our state constitution, including reproductive freedom. I stepped off of chairing the Planned Parenthood New Hampshire Action Fund just to run for this seat because we are still vulnerable to ongoing attacks from this governor. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question is a two-part question. So looking ahead to 2021, what is the biggest challenge you think you might face on the Executive Council in the coming year? And the second part of the question is, what are the life experiences and qualifications that you feel have made you ready to meet that challenge in what's already shaping up to be a very unusual year? And we will start with Emmett Soldati.
So I think I'm going to assume that we're going to vote Sununu out of power. And so that's going to be transformational. And so I actually think the biggest challenge we're going to have on the Executive Council, and indeed all of you in the legislature, is all of our state revenue is down. And we have a broken tax structure in this state. From Keno to gas to meals and rentals, it's all down. And we need to be able to provide funding for services in all of our communities. The reason that my background matches what we need to look forward to in the future is not only do I represent the next generation as the youngest Democrat running, but also I have lived on the ground level in the communities that we need to serve through these agencies. And not only have I lived there, I started off there as a kid, and I've seen the transformation of a small, poor community like Somersworth through communities and people connecting around shared values that need cultural, political, and economic dividends, and we need to do that to transform all of the communities in New Hampshire.
Thank you. Leah Plunkett.
I think one of the biggest issues is the fact that our public school system is being abandoned. It has been ignored by this governor and his administration. And as we try to get back to school this fall, they are further ignoring it and threatening the ability of working families like mine. I'm a full-time working mom of 2 young kids in our public school system. I'm also an educator myself. I'm an NEA member. And I think that figuring out how to repair public education and more broadly to make sure that this governor and his administration, who will hopefully vote it out, but even if they are, we still have some repair work to do, can be reined in when it comes to their unilateral attack on public education and other core institutions. As an educator myself and as a law professor, I am uniquely suited to be on the front lines of repairing the education system. I also have lived experience right now with the failure of this system and its potential to wipe out the ability for working families, particularly working moms, to continue to hold jobs and provide safely for themselves.
Thank you. Cinde Warmington.
We are in the middle of a global pandemic, a healthcare crisis, the likes of which we've never seen before. And we are going to be continuing to face that crisis and rebuilding from this pandemic over the course of the next term of this executive council. Whether we are able to defeat Sununu or not, that is going to be the pivotal issue of the next term of the executive council. And specifically, some of the issues that are going to come before the executive council are reallocation of resources that have already been budgeted within the agencies. These agencies are going to be looking to reallocate resources because of the new demands and the decreased tax revenue. The council plays a pivotal role in that.
15 seconds.
With respect to healthcare, we have so many people who have lost health insurance during this crisis and who have no access to healthcare. And we need to make sure that we provide affordable access to healthcare for every Granite Stater.
And Jay Surdukowski, if he's joined us. And if not, Craig Thompson, you're up.
Thanks. It's not the crises that are impending, it's the crises that we're living through now that we need to address. The first is the climate crisis. The second is the need to increase wages. And we can do that from the council. We need to make sure that gubernatorial nominees believe in climate change and are committed to doing something about it. That's particularly true with nominees to the Public Utilities Commission, the Site Evaluation Committee. And we can work on increasing wages when we start talking about state contracts. We need to make sure that the companies that are doing business with the state are paying their employees not a minimum wage, but a living wage. And given the fact that I'm a farmer and I deal with the climate crisis on a daily basis, and I'm a small business owner and I've figured out how to pay my employees wages, I think I'm well suited to deal with those two issues. Thank you.
And just a reminder to the folks who are watching, if you're not a moderator, if you're not a candidate, please mute your phone. Our third question. In 2019, Governor Sununu nominated Attorney General Gordon MacDonald to serve as Chief Justice of the New Hampshire State Supreme Court, and the current Executive Council rejected that nomination by a 3-2 margin. Governor Sununu has yet to put forward another nominee. Knowing what you know about the MacDonald situation, do you think you would have voted for or against his nomination, and can you explain why? And our first candidate to answer will be Cinde Warmington.
I would decidedly have voted against that nomination, not only because of the long history of anti-choice positions that Gordon MacDonald had taken in the past, but also his blatant hostility towards voting rights. Since the defeat of that nomination, Gordon MacDonald has continued to pursue voter suppression laws in this state. He has continued to demonstrate his partisanship, that he is really truly the Attorney General for the Republican Party and not for the state of New Hampshire. And I believe he is not qualified to serve on our Supreme Court. So if renominated by Governor Sununu, I would also vote against that nomination.
Thank you. Craig Thompson.
Yeah, there's no way I could have supported the McDonald nomination. One, because he's not solid on reproductive rights, and we know that from the council we need to protect reproductive rights. But second, there's a real question here of experience and qualifications. This governor has a track record of appointing nominees who are not qualified, and for that reason alone, I couldn't have supported the McDonald nomination either. You know, we've gotten ourselves in a situation where this governor has gotten away with appointing a commissioner of education who doesn't believe in public schools, a commissioner of agriculture who doesn't know anything about agriculture or climate change, and tried to appoint a dentist as poet laureate. So to me, experience and qualifications matter. And that's not just in the case of
15 seconds.
but anybody else the governor might nominate.
Thank you. Leah Plunkett.
I spoke out firmly and clearly when that nomination was live. I issued a press release in my role as Planned Parenthood New Hampshire Action Fund Board Chair. I co-wrote a couple of pieces with Jennifer Frizzell, longtime leader in reproductive choice and women's rights, and I said unequivocally that Gordon MacDonald was not qualified. That was a hard thing to do. Dozens of people in the legal profession spoke out publicly for Attorney General MacDonald's nomination, including some of my colleagues at the law school. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but my opinion was clear then, and it is clear now. I got into this race to keep Gordon MacDonald and other unqualified judges from being on our courts, and I'm staying strong on that position. There's no room to have to guess how I would have voted. I was quite clear about it at the time. I agree that there are many other pressing issues of individual freedoms and civil liberties that our state Supreme Court is responsible for, so we need to be broadly vigilant.
Thank you. Emmett Soldati.
Yeah, it was a no for me when it came up, and it would be a no again should he ever get renominated. Clearly, from his track record of having an anti-choice position and his willingness to take that into the courts. And it's worth noting that the Executive Council didn't know that. It was Planned Parenthood folks like Leah and others that actually blew the whistle on it. And that's why we need people that are well connected to the reproductive justice community to understand and vet people that are being appointed to judgeships. It's also worth noting that he doesn't have lower court qualifications. I'm one of the only 5 people in the last 3 decades to ever actually submit a pro se brief and win a case in our state Supreme Court. One of them is being Rennie Cushing. And it's important to have the experience of having lower court experience when adjudicating issues on our Supreme Court. I know that from a personal experience, and I know that to safeguard the reproductive rights and freedoms of all Granite Staters, and that is always the executive counselor that I'll be.
Something I wanted to just bring up, it looks like one of our candidates is not going to be with us tonight. So I think one of the things that we might do just to make it a little bit easier for everybody, I sense folks running out of time and being almost there with the 1-minute responses. So what we'll do, Kathy, if this is okay with you, is we'll go from 1 minute to a minute and a half. But what I would ask the candidates to do is still try to keep your answers to about a minute or so. But I think that way there might be a little less interruption and the flow might be a little bit better.
Do you want me to tell them when there's a minute or 30 seconds left now?
It would be like a minute and 30 seconds. So give somebody a cue if they're getting to like a minute and 15 seconds. We would give them a cue to wrap up.
Still 15-second warning.
And
Yes,
if you don't
15
mind my
seconds.
saying,
Okay.
as
All
the
right. Thank you
chair,
much.
Sorry, this is Chris. Can you hear me? We did confirm that Jay Surdukowski had confirmed to attend tonight. We hope he's safe. I have tweeted our disappointed, though, that he is not here and hope that he is safe and well. So moving on.
And if he does come in at some point, we will switch back and we'll be a little bit tighter with our responses. Fourth question, and this will actually go out to Leah Plunkett first. If you find yourself faced with approving a future nominee to a critical judgeship who shares a very different philosophical perspective from your own, how would you approach the situation and how would you make your decision?
I would make my decision by fairly and comprehensively evaluating the qualifications and the commitments of candidates. I think Emmett is completely right that we need to make sure that we are hearing from leaders and folks affected by our court system in various ways, and I would be looking for guidance and input from folks who are really impacted by being before courts, like my former clients at New Hampshire Legal Assistance when I was a youth law project lawyer, as well as the folks I worked on behalf of as a consumer rights attorney following that. I'm not looking for judges to be cookie cutter copies of each other. There are many ways to have the qualifications and the ethics and the integrity to be in our court system. But for me, having a commitment to upholding individual rights and freedoms under our state constitution, under our state laws and regulations, and under federal laws and federal constitution as well is non-negotiable. And as a law professor, I'm uniquely suited to put together the kind of rigorous engagement with nominees in confirmation hearings. It's what law professors do for fun. We ask tough questions, as well as I have the background as an advocate to make sure that I am lifting up the insights and concerns from folks most impacted by our court system.
Thank you. Craig Thompson.
Thanks. I appreciate that, David. You know, for me, I think it's important to bring in a diversity of voices in this type of a decision. You know, for me, that would start with the likes of the ACLU. And given the current climate, Black Lives Matter. But there's also a whole lot of smart people in the Democratic Party that we can turn to. And I would turn to people like Leah and Cinde and say, hey, what's your take on this? This is your area of expertise, and I would appreciate your insight.
Thank you. Cinde Warmington.
I certainly would agree that I would do a fair and comprehensive evaluation, including a review of the person's prior record. I would look for experience and in particular preference for judicial experience, but also experience in the courtroom. As we mentioned, Gordon MacDonald had never even tried a case and was nominated. So I'd like to see some of that experience. I would also reach out to stakeholders. As the chair of the New Hampshire Democratic Party's platform committee, I have been on listening tours all around this state to hear about the values that are important to Democrats, and that is what I would do in this role. I would be listening to all of the stakeholders who have a role here. But first and foremost for me is that any judicial nominee needs to have a firm commitment to upholding our fundamental rights, our constitutional rights. We absolutely cannot negotiate on that point, and that is key for me.
Emmett Soldati.
Could you restate the question one more time?
Sure. If you find yourself faced with approving a future nominee to a critical judgeship who shares a very different philosophical perspective from your own, how would you handle the situation and how would you make your decision?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to note that obviously, like others have just said, and in the last answer, there are certain rights, particularly constitutional ones, that is a litmus test for having a judgeship. I do have to say, though, that the Executive Council is not just a matter of approving or denying. There's a long process that leads up to that. That includes vetting. That also includes constituent services. And I look to an Executive Councilor like Ray Burton, who really set the bar for a constituent service Executive Council. Less than a third of Granite Staters have ever heard of the Executive Council. And that means that for too long, our Executive Council has been satisfied with less than a third of their constituents knowing what they're up to. We can't have decisions being made behind closed doors. We can't have people not understanding or knowing that there are vacancies that they or experts in their community could be filling. So as your next Executive Councilor, my role would be to make sure you understand someone's philosophy, you understand their track record. And even if I vote no on them and they still get approved, you as a constituent have a better understanding of who's in our courts, who's in our agencies, and who we're doing business with. That's the kind of Executive Councilor I would plan to be.
Thank you. In addition to judges, there are quite a few other types of appointees that the governor appoints to different offices and top state positions. What are some of the universal criteria that you might apply in evaluating any nominee, really, that comes before you? And what are some of the potential red flags that you might be looking out for? And our first person to respond would be Craig Thompson.
So I've actually addressed this issue a fair bit because to me, the real opportunity here in reinventing the Executive Council is the opportunity to use it to respond to the climate crisis. And my goal as a counselor is to make sure that everyone nominated and everyone approved by the council understands that that crisis is here and now, and we need to start transitioning to renewable energy. And anybody who tells me they don't believe in that isn't going to get my support. And anybody who does say that they understand that, then my next question will be, what are you going to do about it from your position within state government? If we take this approach, we have the potential to actually populate the entire apparatus of state government with people who understand the urgency of the moment and are prepared to act.
Thank you. Emmett Soldati.
Yeah, I would certainly agree that there are very clear and obvious litmus tests for certain positions. You know, if you're going to head the DES, you should believe in science and you should have a background in it. If you're going to head the Education Commission, you should have a background in advancing public school funding and supporting public schools. But I think more than that, when it comes to representation, the thing I often think about coming from Somersworth, one of the smallest and poorest cities, is we hear a lot about the opioid epidemic in New Hampshire, and particularly in communities like Somersworth. And we've been hearing about it for a very long time. And I think for too long, our boards and our agencies, though they are meant to service people that are in poverty or have a substance use disorder or are housing unstable, our boards and agencies don't have people at the table that have experiences as a SNAP recipient or with a substance use disorder. And so for me, across all of our boards, I think it's important to evaluate the lived experience of poverty, the lived experience of substance use disorder, and ask any nominee, how close are they to someone in recovery? How close are they to a SNAP recipient? Because if we're going to talk about staffing our DHHS, it's not just a matter of have we worked with the commissioners in the past, it's a matter of have we ever interfaced with them? Have we ever been a beneficiary of them? When we talk about unemployment, it's not whether we've worked with the Unemployment Services Commissioner before, or unemployment security. It's whether if we've ever had to apply for unemployment or ever had to have a worker that was unemployed and go through that process. So I think the experiences of poverty and recovery need a much bigger seat at the table.
Thank you. Cinde Warmington.
First and foremost, any nominee for any position needs to believe in the mission of the agency, the commission, the board that they are intended to serve on. And I would ask probing questions to make sure that that person has, in fact, a demonstrated commitment to the mission of the organization that they will serve. You know, we see the problems in our Department of Education with a commissioner of education right now who simply doesn't believe in public education. And that cannot be permitted as we move forward. I think diversity on all of our boards and commissions is critically important. The Executive Council does not have the role of making nominations, but it can certainly recommend nominations to the governor and should do so on a regular basis. This governor has let positions throughout this government sit empty rather than appoint people that are not favorable to him, and often that means from a political perspective. And that the light needs to be shined on that if Sununu is still in that seat, to let people know that he is leaving the people of New Hampshire without representation. We need to have diverse representation across our boards, commissions, and agencies of competent people who believe in the mission of the organization they'll be serving.
And finally, Leah Plunkett.
I agree with what's been said about basic competency and fundamentally believing in the mission of the agency that you are heading up. I think those are crucial, and we can't take those for granted with this administration. I also think that it's crucial that we are building a pipeline and that we are having folks get prepared. Obviously, the council can't bring forward nominees, but the council can help nurture and elevate folks from diverse backgrounds to have a more inclusive, equitable slate of leaders across our agencies, something that I've taken really seriously and really find to be an honor in my work at the law school is mentoring and working to be a supporter and a booster of folks who bring qualifications and also bring a form of experience that might not be readily apparent from just looking at a resume. I do think in New Hampshire sometimes there can be a little bit of a sit down, wait your turn, wait, let other people handle this. And I really think that that is not healthy. It's not healthy for the Democratic Party. It is not healthy for our state democracy. And it's not healthy for the outcomes that matter to
15
working
seconds.
families.
Thank you. Our sixth question. The George Floyd murder has sparked anger and a desire for racial justice across the country and across New Hampshire. As an executive counselor, what will you do to make a difference in that role for members of the New Hampshire minority communities? And we'll start with Craig Thompson.
So, you know, this is a huge question, and it's one that we have to get right. We know that we need to bring more diversity into state government. And to me, there's a good model for doing that. It's actually comes from the National Football League, which is not usually a great place to look for models, but about 20 years ago, they adopted what they call the Rooney Rule. And every team that wants to hire a new head coach is required to interview at least one minority candidate. They've expanded that, so now teams have to also interview minority candidates for assistant head coaches because nobody becomes a head coach without being an assistant coach. We need that type of mindset that we are actively bringing people of color into the process. I think the Democratic Party has a responsibility to do that in recruiting candidates. I would like to think that the Republican Party would take up that effort as well. And bigger picture, we also need to be talking about how do we demilitarize our police forces? Because, you know, right now we've got, Keene has an armored, I don't know what they call it, a Bearcat. I mean, they have an armored vehicle. That's crazy. I think that we can look at this issue long and hard and think about how we want to direct funding
15 seconds.
to more appropriate resources like schools and the social services. Thanks.
Emmett Soldati.
So representation certainly matters, and I think we recognize that racial equity it intersects across several organizations, and I'd love to give you three in particular that we can affect on Executive Council. The first is our Education Commissioner. We need to have an Education Commissioner that has the sophistication to understand how racism permeates throughout our schools. That also includes how homophobia permeates throughout our schools. Number two is that we approve everyone appointed to the Police Standards and Training Council. And if you look up the Police Standards and Training Council, it'll tell you how many push-ups you have to do. It'll tell you how to use a firearm. There is no reference to race, gender identity, or community policing contained anywhere within there. We need to ask every nominee how they will be working for the community and not against the community when they are setting the standards for police across the state. And lastly, we need to ask the next Attorney General whether or not they are going to cooperate with Customs and Border Patrol and ICE in trying to detain people that live in New Hampshire up at Woodstock, because those are illegal, those are criminal stops, and we do not need to be cooperating with federal investigations in those federal bureaus. We've never asked an Attorney General nominee if they'll cooperate. I will be the candidate and the counselor that would.
Cinde Warmington.
We've already talked about how we are going to bring more diversity to our nominees. And that involves bringing forth and recommending nominees that are diverse and people of color for all of the boards and commissions that, that come before us. But in addition to that, every 2 weeks, the Executive Council gets to question the commissioners of all of our agencies on contracts. And at that time, they have the opportunity to ask all sorts of questions. And one of the questions they need to start asking is, what are you doing in your agency to root out discrimination and to bring diversity to your agency? And have every commissioner that we have be accountable for that. In addition to that, as I have spoken many times about the need to intervene in the contracting process much earlier. Right now, the Executive Council does not see the contracts that come before it until the Friday night before its Wednesday meeting. But if we get in early, we can start asking questions at the 6, 8, 10 months in advance on the RFP. And race needs to be one of the factors taken into consideration when contracts are given. We need diversity in our state contractors, and we need to ask them if their workforce is diverse. So we need to take on this problem from a comprehensive perspective.
Thank you. Next question. As you know, the current council was embroiled in a controversy over the nomination of two Black candidates, Ryan Terrell and Eddie Edwards, who were nominated to state positions by Governor Sununu. How would you approach a situation where there were questions about the qualifications or background of the nominee from a minority community? And the first person to respond will be Emmett Soldati.
Yeah, I think the big challenge we have here is we have a long-standing track record in this state of never having representation or diversity. And that puts a huge onus on the people of color, queer people, and other individuals of an underrepresented minority to have an extra fine-tooth comb that gets reviewed with their qualifications, with their background and experiences. I think if we do better, if we have an executive council and a state government that is actually committed to racial justice, actually committed to representation that reflects the actual true diversity of so many of our small communities and towns, then we won't be in this issue where we have to look at one or two individual appointments and say that this is the problem. Because I actually thought looking through that whole process, though I may not agree with the individuals philosophically, I may not agree with them ideologically, too often the qualification concept or the experience concept is used to keep people away from the table. And I think we need to start thinking about how are we setting certain qualifications that actually just bars people from the conversation, bars them from the nomination process, bars them from the networks of people that get plucked by a governor, Democrat or governor, to be put on boards, agencies, and commissions. I'm running a campaign full of coalitions of townies from Winchester and Hinsdale to my hometown of Somersworth, people that haven't had a seat at the table, people that are immigrants, people that are in recovery, people that come from a whole range of underrepresented backgrounds that definitely have the qualifications, definitely have the experience that New Hampshire's next generation needs to succeed. And I think if we start turning the tide now, we won't have to have the conversation about one or two people because we'll have plenty of nominees and folks that are helping our state.
Leah Plunkett.
I would look to have conversations directly with nominees who are coming forward, as well as members of the communities from which they come. I think it is absolutely crucial that the council hold the line at having people in positions be meeting the qualifications of skill set, believing in the mission of the appointment for which they are being brought forward, but also that we take an expansive look at what it means to have qualifications, and that we recognize that there are many skill sets that can be transferable. And simply because you haven't checked a certain box on your resume, or maybe haven't checked it just yet, it doesn't mean that you don't have the courage, integrity, creativity, and sense of mission and drive to excel in the role you're brought forward for. So I think that that is an ongoing conversation that can evolve, and it does not need to be either we have folks who are members of communities of color, or that we have folks who more than fulfill, the qualifications and experience and leadership, which is ultimately what we're looking for. Governor Sununu and the Republican Party have tried to create a false trade-off that does not need to exist.
Thank you. Cinde Warmington.
I think with respect to qualifications, we need to make sure that we root out institutional racism that may exist in our current paradigm of what a qualified person is. I'll give a really simple example. When we discovered some years ago that the SAT test that's used for students to get into college actually had a racial bias. Well, that's a lens that maybe all of us have to look through, and we all need to make sure that we've rooted out institutional racism as a part of the qualification process. We also need to understand that in some positions, race is a qualification. We need to have those people of color, we need to have their voices at the table. And if we don't have people of color at the table, then we need to. And I agree completely with what other candidates here have said, that we still need to have the basic qualifications must be met, that the person has the skills and that the person is committed to the mission of the organization. But we need a different lens that we look at nominations through to make sure that we have rooted out institutional racism.
Craig Thompson.
So, we know in New Hampshire that people of color represent about 7% of the population. I feel like we should set a goal as a state that those who are serving the state, we mirror that at the very minimum. 7% of the state employees and people in those positions should be from communities of color. Stop and think about the New Hampshire House of Representatives for a moment. If we got to the place where 7% of the House of Representatives was people of color, we'd be talking about 25 or 30 members instead of 2 or 3. I think that's really significant. I would just add that there's real value in bringing organizations to the conversation when it comes to this type of nominee. Certainly the movement for Black Lives should be in on the conversation. But we have to remember that we, in the effort to bring diversity to the state, have to be prepared to acknowledge the fact that many people of color might not be Democrats. They might not agree with us on policy or principles, but that we still need to be comfortable with that. Thanks.
Thank you. And was that a message that I saw that I might have skipped somebody in a previous question?
Don't worry about it, David. I'm getting plenty of time to answer. We're all good. I'm back in the rotation.
I'm so sorry. I'm
No,
so sorry.
don't worry about it.
Trying to track this stuff is a challenge. Thank you for your understanding. Our next question. During the pandemic, there's been ongoing tension between the governor and several councilors over hundreds of millions of dollars that are being spent on no-bid, single-source contracts that have been awarded by the governor under his emergency powers. At times, these contracts were awarded without council approval and were included as informational items on the council agenda rather than as items for debate and approval. Knowing that the pandemic is likely going to last well into 2021 and we could have the same governor sitting there, how would you approach a similar situation if it happened during your term of office? And I will start with Cinde Warmington, and this time I will not forget Leah Plunkett.
So I mentioned earlier that I have a transformational vision for the Executive Council. I'm calling it the 3 C's: contracts, coordination, and the caucus. And I think if we had a different, if the Executive Council had an expanded role, then I think we could have avoided some of the problems that we are facing currently with the governor. Right now, when I say contracts, I mean getting into these agencies earlier and really asking the questions sooner. Right now, the governor controls the agenda, and he often puts contracts on the agenda at the last minute when the council really is left with no choice but to approve them, or some terrible disaster will befall the state. That's not going to happen anymore when I'm an executive counselor, because I am going to be getting in earlier, and if he tries that, we simply are not going to accept that. The second is coordinating with the legislature. If there had been early coordination with the Executive Council and the legislature working together, we may have been more successful at blocking the governor from usurping the power of the legislature, which he did. And I think that is it's a critical role. I've been endorsed by more than 40 of the current legislators in the legislature, and I have a long history of working together on democratic values, and I am uniquely positioned to coordinate with legislatures to make sure that the policy that they adopt actually turns out to be in the contracts that we execute. And finally, the Democratic Caucus, which Andy Valinsky formed, is currently in a shell form, but it can be used in the same way that the House and Senate's Democratic Caucus is used to strengthen the Executive Council, and that is what I would intend to do.
Craig Thompson.
Thank you. This issue with this governor is something that none of us are surprised by. As the only person in the race who's actually serving in the House and has served in the House, there's no doubt in my mind that we need to synchronize our efforts between the House, the Council, and the Senate to oppose this governor really at every turn, and particularly on issues like this. I also think that we have to really be prepared to use the council as a bully pulpit, as in one sense, the Democrats on the council need to form or offer a shadow government and an alternative path forward, and need to be very vocal about that and telling that story, sharing that narrative with the public of where we want to go and how we're going to get there. in standing up against this governor, we have the chance to really force him to come to the table and be a participant and not a lone actor in governing the state. I really welcome that opportunity.
Leah Plunkett.
Our campaign sent an open letter to the governor back in the beginning of April. We gathered over 100 signatures from over 40 cities and towns and publicly called upon him to put this life-saving federal stimulus money through the proper channels of the Joint Fiscal Committee and the Executive Council. And we are going to keep right on making those kind of firm, bold, not requests, but demands, because this governor, in many ways, this is just one of them. He governs by veto, and he has not seated a Chief Justice for the New Hampshire Supreme Court, so he's disrespecting a co-equal branch of government, but he is consolidating power in a very unilateral, almost authoritarian way. And he does it behind sort of a facade of, being that super nice guy, but, he's that guy who's nice to you at the bar and then talks about you behind your back. We all know that. And counselors have been doing a really good job, and there's room for everyone on the council to continue to do this and build upon it, to talk publicly and regularly to their constituents about what is in those informational items to make them accessible and digestible by the people as the ultimate watchdogs of our government, and be prepared to hold the line at not giving approval for other state spending on which they do have a vote if the governor continues to proceed in this unilateral, non-democratic way.
Time.
And Emmett Soldati.
And I'm assuming the subtext of this question is you are positing that if Sununu gets reelected?
Yes.
So there's some gloom and doom here. So I think, and many of the folks that spoke before me, we all saw and watched how Sununu attempted to create his own fund using federal government money that had absolutely no accountability to the people. We've talked many times, all of us, I believe, were on a press call calling for them to use the Legislative Fiscal Committee, not establish Gopher, because at the end of the day, if a small business owner or someone, a sole proprietor, runs out of money or they don't get what they need, there's no accountability. They have no one to go to. And I do have to agree, I agree with a lot. People have talked about transforming the Executive Council. Cinde mentioned this idea of the 3 Cs. We've also heard ways in the past about having an expedited contract review if it has to do with public safety. There are things that need to get done at New Hampshire's hospital right now for psychiatric patients that probably should get money sooner than other expenditures. But the problem is all of that, because of our executive councils in the charter, that has to be done through the legislature. That has to be done with all of you to recognize how we are structuring our executive council to be a stronger check on the governor. We have seen through this governor a worst case scenario. So we know that when we try to build protections for people through various agencies or through ending the no bid contract process, we need you to help us do that. But at the end of the day, I'm bringing a small business owner perspective, someone that saw firsthand what it means to lose a business, to lose your employees, to lose your income. And this governor is not looking out for people like me. And as an executive counselor, I will make sure we change that next year.
Thank you. So next question. The pandemic has basically changed things up completely, I think, for everybody in state government. How has the COVID-19 pandemic changed the way you see your potential role on the Executive Council? Are there things you might do, questions you might ask, and actions you might take that you may not have considered if there wasn't a state of emergency in place? And Leah Plunkett, you will go first.
I got into this race to stick up for having trustworthy courts, agencies that will work for working families, and pragmatic and ethical state spending. The pandemic has definitely changed the scope and the urgency of some of the crises that our state was facing, and it's added new ones. But there have been a lot of breaks in our state that predate the pandemic. We have had an ongoing crisis with our inability through DCYF to protect our most vulnerable children. That has only been heightened by the demands of the pandemic. We have long been unable to fulfill our state constitutional guarantee of an individual fundamental right to public education. We're now seeing the collapse of our public education system under the governor and Edelbluth's non-plan plan, which was really designed to create chaos and pit people against each other. So as a counselor during and after, hopefully after sooner than later, the pandemic, I would be vigilant about repairing all of the breaks in our state's inability to provide for public health and public safety.
15 seconds.
Thank you. Craig Thompson.
So I think the pandemic has really emphasized the importance of fighting for progressive values. You know, we see starkly what it means to advocate for healthcare as a right, not a privilege. We see the shortcoming of tying health insurance to employment. We see the real downside all too clearly of people who are financially vulnerable because they aren't earning a living wage. So, you know, these things are all progressive policy issues. And had they been in place before the pandemic, New Hampshire residents would be in a much better place today than they are now.
Emmett Soldati.
I think the Executive Council is more necessary now because every progressive goal that we have, whether it's Medicaid, SNAP, unemployment, has to get administered. And the Executive Council is responsible for helping select the leadership that administers it. And I'll give you an example. When over 100,000 granted-staters applied for unemployment, the vast majority of them waited over 6 weeks to get their first paycheck. The reason is the technology platform that hosted the unemployment system is 20 years old. If we had a commissioner or head of our economic security that was concerned about the most vulnerable populations, folks that could be on the margins or folks that could be unemployed, they wouldn't have kicked the can decades and decades to fix that system. I want to also talk about retirement because we are responsible for vetting and approving the people that sit on New Hampshire's retirement system. That's a council of people that decide how to invest all of the state retirees or all the state workers and their money to determine their funds. Your retirement and those pensions aren't based on the money you pay into it. It's based on the market. And the market is not looking very good right now. And we need to vet people that are sitting on the New Hampshire retirement system to make sure that they are prepared and sophisticated enough to protect our retirees today and protect our retirees tomorrow. So I think we need to advance issues related to leadership of how we administer these progressive values, because it's not just enough to have all these programs. We have to actually understand what it looks like on the ground.
Thank you. Cinde Warmington.
We need to ask every one of our commissioners and our nominees how they are going to adapt their agency to be able to serve the mission during COVID. COVID is going to continue for some time now. And we need to know that we have nominees in every place that are thinking about how they're going to meet the mission of their organization during COVID. It's been mentioned here that technology is a critical issue. We've seen that the gap in technology in our rural communities has impacted the ability of students to obtain education, of patients to receive telehealth services. It is across of small businesses to continue to function during COVID. It is across the board an issue that needs to be addressed, and that's more of a priority now than it was pre-COVID. But in every way, COVID has heightened and made clear the issues where the poor in our state are disproportionately impacted. And we can absolutely see that the Executive Council has a key role both in nominations and in contracting and in coordinating with the legislature to make sure that those gaps are addressed once and for all. This is something that I have been working on as chair of the platform committee for many years. As a grassroots activist, I've been knocking on doors for these values for 20 years, and these are things I would do as your executive counselor.
Thank you. We are going to move on to the section of our forum where we're actually taking questions from the chat, and I'm looking at these questions now. And the first question is, is a very good one. As legislators, one of the things that we have to do is we have to declare any potential conflicts of interest that we have when making a potential decision. I think what I'd like to do is just go through everybody one at a time. And if there are conflicts like that that you think you might have, if you could just maybe talk about them a little bit and what your plan might be to resolve them. And I think I'll start with Leah Plunkett.
Thanks, David. That is such an important question. So I am actually on leave from UNH Law right now. I'm visiting remotely away and teaching at another school. So I am not currently a UNH/USNH employee. And I look forward to returning from my leave in the future. And so hopefully as your next executive counselor and rejoining UNH at that time, then I would of course make clear that I was employed by UNH/USNH for anything that came up that related specifically to UNH. My husband is an attorney at a local law firm, and so I would have to be, conflicted out of anything that related to a representation that he or his firm was involved in, and I'll be, quite candid about those. Oh, and I'm sorry, David, if I may add very quickly, Craig had mentioned earlier lawyers and lobbyists. I just want to be clear. I have been registered as a lobbyist, but it was only on behalf of New Hampshire legal assistants. I've actually never been in private practice myself, no disrespect to anyone who is.
Thank you. Craig Thompson.
So certainly I would step down from the Farm Bureau's Legislative Affairs Committee. But this really, and I, off the top of my head, I can't really think of any conflicts that I would have. But this really goes to the issue of transparency and really goes to the heart of how we fund our campaigns. Every candidate in this race has to answer for how they are paying for the things they're doing. I'm really proud of the fact that my campaign is funded by people. And I haven't taken a cent from corporations or lobbyists or the fossil fuel industry. I wish I could say that about everybody else, because the fossil fuel industry has done a really good job of splitting the Democratic Party by throwing around money. And, last month, or I guess it was in June, some of the candidates in this race had to file a financial filing with the Secretary of State's office. My campaign didn't, because of the way we're organized, but we filed that financial filing anyway, and we asked the Secretary of State's office to publish it because we wanted the public to see where our money was coming from. The SOS said no, they wouldn't publish it because we didn't have to, so we made it available on our website. And you can see it for yourself at craigthompsonfornh.com. There's a tab that says financials, click it and take a look. Thanks.
Cinde Warmington.
So I'm an attorney at Shaheen & Gordon, and when I entered into this race, I sat down with Andy Valinsky, who was also an attorney, and asked him about how he handled the conflict situation. He was gracious enough to share his conflict letter with me. But for me, I have described that I have a transformational vision for the Executive Council. This vision is so broad and so deep that I cannot imagine trying to take it on as a part-time job. And so I am prepared to dedicate my full-time attention to the Executive Council, and therefore expect to and will step down from my position at Shaheen & Gordon, and therefore will eliminate that level of conflict. My husband is an attorney at Shaheen & Gordon, and as Deb Pignatelli, who sits on the council now, has to navigate that, I would navigate those conflicts, but those are expected to be minimal. I will say that I want to address the issue of transparency. I think transparency and campaign finance reform is very, very critical. My preference would be publicly funded campaign finance, but we don't have that. And to me, transparency is the key issue. And I have filed my financial disclosure in the most transparent way that it can be done.
Thank you. Emmett Soldati.
Yeah, I believe I have no conflicts of interest. I'm probably unique, and I've almost never completed a W-2, having run my own business for the last 10 years. In fact, I'm a constituent of the Department of Revenue Administration. I'm a constituent of the Department of Health and Human Services. And so, rather than having lobbied for any particular group, organization, or company, I have, I think, a unique vision of what it's actually like to be served by these organizations that I would then be in the position to appoint and approve or deny folks that sit on them. Of course, I agree with what's been said about transparency and also campaign finance reform. Like Craig, I've signed the No Fossil Fuel Pledge. We're raising the money to build a statewide infrastructure for this campaign from $6.03 every Sunday. And that's included hundreds and hundreds of people that recognize that they do want a seat at the table. These are townies, these are folks that are unemployed, these are people that have lost their businesses and their jobs because of COVID. And I don't feel right asking them for any more than that.
Thank you. Next question. Is there an experience in your background that you believed shaped you in a way that will make you a more effective voice for people in your district that you would like to share with us? And we'll start with Craig Thompson.
So farming informs everything I do, because farming is a long-term proposition. It's not how much you can bill an hour. It's not about how many clients you've got in your Rolodex. It's what are you planning today that will yield a harvest 7, 10, 15 years down the road. We know that on a farm, we have to invest in the future. We have to build fertility and take care of our crops and our animals, because that's how we are successful long-term. One of the biggest problems in New Hampshire politics is that with an election every 2 years, there is very little long-term planning. But on a farm, we plan for the next generation and not the next election. That is how I think of everything. And that is the perspective that I would certainly bring to the council. We see the need for that in something like our antiquated tax structure, which has gotten penny wise and pound foolish. We've lost the wisdom or the foresight to invest in our future. And that's why we have a higher education system that's funding ranks 50th in the nation at the same time that we rank #1 for exporting college kids out of state.
15 seconds.
And so that long-term perspective is exactly what I would bring to the council.
Emmett Soldati.
Those that know me well probably want me to talk about having the largest teen drag show here at Teetotaler, but I want to share something else. This month, I'm celebrating 10 years of getting sober. And that was for very personal reasons. But I have to say what that has done is it's brought me closer to my hometown of Somersworth and closer to a community that growing up, I didn't really see. And that's the recovery community and folks that are struggling with a substance use disorder. Those of us that are active in this space recognize that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's community and it's connection. And I have been able to connect and hear stories about people that have struggled with a substance use disorder because they have felt disconnected, because they have felt invisible, and because they have felt unseen. And it is the reason I continue to stay in Somersworth after I moved home 10 years ago, because I found a community here in my hometown, the smallest city in New Hampshire, that I thought didn't exist the world over. And I wouldn't have had that experience if it wasn't for me going through the process of my own recovery journey and connecting with so many other people that are navigating themselves. And I'm just trying to help other people connect with that same value.
Cinde Warmington.
I guess I'll take two, one from some years back and then one more recent. I was the first in my family to ever go to college. I'm a product of public education. And I remember my parents being so excited about my plans to go to college, but also remember how difficult it was for them to sit down and explain to me that they did not have the financial resources to help and that I would have to pay my own way. And I worked my way through college 30 hours a week, as you said, as a phlebotomist, starting out drawing blood at my local hospital. And I accumulated some debt. I picked my major in part because I knew I needed a job when I graduated in order to pay off my debt. And I graduated with a very reasonable amount of debt, which I paid off over 7 years. And I want to say how this impacts me is that there's a sense of accomplishment from doing that. There's also a sense of despair for me that so many young people today don't have that option, and that some may actually miss going to get a higher education because they simply can't afford it. What we've done in burdening our students with this student debt is just deplorable. It's a huge issue for me, and I think we need to address that. I can't probably do the second, but I will say this. My younger brother suffered from early onset dementia. I became his primary caretaker about 5 years ago, and I had to navigate the healthcare system in a way I never had before. And that was a powerful experience for me, and it put me in very clear touch with all of the people out there who fall through the cracks of our healthcare system.
Thank you. Leah Plunkett.
I love this question. I just learned some really important things. So thank you all for sharing. I'll share, for me, I've had the good fortune of having 2 kids delivered at the family place in Concord Hospital within the last 10 years. And when my first child was born, my husband was in the room with case files that he was working on for the New Hampshire Attorney General's office. He was an assistant attorney general at the time. So, there we are, brand new newborn baby, first time parents, and so fortunate to have received amazing care as a patient at Concord Hospital and to be raising our family here, but also having to balance as a young family just getting started, the crushing demands on his time from having to work at our Department of Justice at a time, this was 2010, so state budget slashed, state agencies across the board underfunded and disrespected, and families like ours being asked to balance the failure of our state to properly fund public health and public safety on our own backs. And that is a responsibility
15 seconds.
I'm very proud that he rose to and that we as a family rose to, but it has made me so mindful of the challenges facing young families and working families and folks dedicated to public service.
Thank you. We're going to conclude the question and answer segment of the program tonight. We have a little bit of time left, but probably not enough to go through another round of Q&A. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move right to closing statements. So basically, you have 2 minutes to make your pitch to members of the Progressive Caucus, to viewers that have joined us tonight. Let us know why you think you should be the next executive counselor in District 2. And the first candidate closing statement will come from Cinde Warmington.
I started knocking on doors more than 20 years ago for healthcare for all. That was before the term Medicare for all was even coined. I believe in every fiber of my body that healthcare is a basic human right. That includes mental healthcare, reproductive healthcare, oral healthcare, healthcare from cradle to grave. Every single person is entitled to that. And that has driven me to work to elect Democratic candidates for more than 20 years. I would bring 40 years of healthcare experience to the Executive Council at a time when we have no one on the Executive Council with a healthcare background. But more than that, I really have a vision for the Executive Council where we can put the true power of the Executive Council to work for the people of New Hampshire. And I am prepared to dedicate my full-time attention to the service of the people of New Hampshire. And I am honored to have the opportunity to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Leah Plunkett, and just so everyone knows, then we will hear from Craig Thompson, and finally Emmett Soldati. Leah Plunkett.
Thank you, David, and thank you everybody for being here tonight. I'm bringing to the Executive Council over a decade of experience on Planned Parenthood boards and about 6 years of experience on the ACLU board, where I have chaired our Economic Justice Committee. I'm bringing the perspective of a lawyer dedicated to public service at New Hampshire Legal Assistance and at National Consumer Law Center, and as an educator. I am a union member I am the only working mom full-time, which I'm proud of 2 young kids in our public schools in this race. And I bring the skill set from some of our state's most important boards of trustees to our elected board of trustees. I also bring the front lines lived experience of being part of a working family with kids in our community, trying to build a future for them and for generations to come. And at this moment, when we are watching a state that is abdicating responsibility for our kids, for our older community members, for folks from outside major metropolitan areas, members of communities of color, immigrants, and others who deserve more of a seat at the table, I am a proven, trustworthy voice of standing up courageously for social justice issues the entire time that I have lived in the Granite State, and I very much hope to have the honor of your support to do that as the next executive counselor from District 2.
Thank you. Craig Thompson.
One of the most difficult things for me serving in the House was to be told by Democratic leadership that we should support a $12 an hour minimum wage bill instead of a $15 an hour minimum wage bill, when we all know what's needed is a living wage. One of the hardest things for me in the House was to be told we shouldn't support a carbon tax, even though every economist the world over knows that the single best way to reduce our carbon emissions is through a carbon tax. That type of risk-averse democratic perspective doesn't sit well with me. And it's really motivated me to run for this seat, because we know that this seat will be won by a Democrat. And that Democrat should be a progressive, because we've wasted an opportunity if we just go with the safe choice, the establishment choice, the moderate choice. In this role, I would be a counselor who would work every day to pull the other counselors leftward. But I would also work every day with the members of the Progressive House Caucus. You know, I remember that first meeting in the State House when Chris announced, if you're interested in the Progressive House Caucus, let's meet over in the corner. And a whole bunch of us showed up. I felt like I'd found my people. So I would love your support. And please know that I would work with you every day to make sure that we continue to bring progressive values to New Hampshire, whether it's in the legislature or the Executive Council. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And finally, Emmett Soldati.
Thank you, everyone. You are all here doing what you do because the word progressive means something in your hometowns, in the towns that you work in the towns that you live in. But sometimes it doesn't always feel like that when we look at our state government, when we even look at our party. And I think the reason is that so many of the folks for whom the progressive movement is meant to serve, SNAP recipients, people of color, the LGBTQ community, these are folks that have been kept busy and bruised by a political process that has kept them off the table. And when I ran and decided to run for executive council, I wanted to change that. I wanted to make sure that progressive meant something for our entire state. And when I told folks in my hometown of Somersworth and my own Democratic committee, they were excited because they were inspired that the transformation we saw in the streets of Somersworth can happen in communities across our state. But when I told some folks in the state, and indeed folks in our party, they said the same lines that many of you heard the first time you decided to run for office. You're too young, you're too inexperienced, you're too busy, you're too outspoken, and you're too much of an activist. I don't think that needs to be true. I may be young, but with 10 years as a business owner with one of the leading LGBTQ spaces in our state, I think I've proven that I have experiences on our main street that are valuable to New Hampshire's next generation. I may have experiences that are very different from some of the other folks running, but that didn't stop me from taking on Facebook in New Hampshire's Supreme Court pro se without a lawyer and winning that case that secures the digital rights, not just for me and my business, but for tens of thousands of people across this country. And I may be busy, but I am tired of this line being used to shut out rural, working class, and the activist class from positions of power. And so I'm proud to be endorsed by folks like Ed Butler, Tim Smith, Sherry Frost, Manny Espitio, Matt Wilhelm, and so many others of the Progressive Caucus. And I'm proud to be building a campaign that's raised on $6.03 every Sunday that has still been able to build infrastructure across our state with over 75 active volunteers. Because there are townies across the state that are ready for their turn. They're ready for their voices to be heard. And this is going to be the movement that makes a difference. I'd encourage you to join me at emmettsoldati.com.
I want to thank all the candidates and all of our viewers tonight for taking the time to join us. I know that it's not terribly easy. Some of you are probably on your third or fourth Zoom call of the day. And it's a lot to ask people to get together at night for a session this long. Again, thank you so much to our candidates. This is really an amazing group of people, and I think it's going to be an amazingly difficult choice. But the potential to put somebody really incredible into that seat in the 2nd District is really there. And I think anybody who watched this session tonight, if they come away with any one impression at all, that's the impression that they're going to come away with. One quick reminder, in case anybody's forgotten, September 8th is primary election day. And now is definitely the time to apply to receive your absentee ballot application, if you haven't applied to do that yet. You can actually call your town clerk, and your town clerk will actually send you an application in the mail, or you can get an application from the Secretary of State's website. This is COVID-19 insurance. It's really important that as many people as possible do it. Town clerks, ward officers, election officers from across the state have been gearing up to do this for months. And the one thing I would ask is, don't just request your absentee ballot, fill it out and send it back in as soon as you get it, because none of us is quite sure what's going to happen with the post office. In any case, I'm going to throw things back over to Chris now, and Chris will have a few final words, and we'll be on our way. Chris.
Great job, David, as the moderator, and our 4 candidates. One of you is definitely going to be our next counselor, and I'm thrilled by that. All 4 of you did an excellent job tonight. I still don't know. I've got to keep listening and seeing how your campaigns progress, because I think all 4 of you are amazing, and I appreciate you being here with us tonight. We have 5 more forums, 2 more for Executive Council. To defeat Ted Gatzis is our next one, and with the Manchester, Londonderry area, hosted by State Representative Marjorie Smith. So I hope that you'll be able to help us get the word out about these forums and will join us. We also are having 3 forums to feature key state Senate seats that have open Democratic primaries for the seats currently occupied by Dan Feltus, Martha Fuller Clark, and Senator Hennessy. Sorry. Thank you guys for being here, and hope you'll help us get the word out about our next forums, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all so much.
Thank
Oh,
you.
and good job, Kathy Rogers, timekeeping.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.